In this day of globalization where West is the superpower, it's spreading its power and ideology throughout the world, through media, education, etc. Many Muslim are also affected by these Western ideology, liberalism, communism, veganism, feminism, every ism, no matter how ludicrous it is, people get affected by it. Many internalize these Western ideology as their worldview. Some ditch their religion if it contradict with those new Western ideology, and others deforms their religion in the process of trying to fit it with those Western ideology. Islamic feminism is that of forced fitting hodgepodge by some ignorant mentally colonized people. Feminism is as varied as the number of its adherents, because it is not fixed like Islam. However, the popular and authoritative literature on feminism, across all waves, are diametrically opposed to Islam. This isn't a surprise because anything with non-Islamic origins can never come around to be Islamic, ever. As for maintaining that your version of feminism is just in line with the sunnah, then you admit that Islam is the only viable tool to address any and all types of problems humanity faces at large. That makes the use of the feminist label completely useless, unless you're arguing that there's a real need for the label and the movement on top of what Islam provides to address issues of women. There's no way out of it. Either admit that Islam lacks and feminism fills in the gap in it, or just chuck away the feminist label altogether, because Islam is enough anyway, because feminism is a kufri creation with its most prominent manifestations rife with kufri practices and beliefs in the name of equity. Feminism is defined by the civilization who coined it, who currently still write about it and use it, and of which will always be understood in relation to Muslim feminism, a legacy of colonial currency. Some Muslims, who insist on calling themselves feminists, often complain that when Muslims criticize the values and concepts behind the feminism, these criticisms are only against Western feminism, which they allege is different feminism from their feminism. This is because they were attracted to, and then taken the word feminism, from the West, but then amongst themselves allegedly chosen to redefine their way, call it Muslim feminism. They then desperately claim that despite taking the word feminism from the West, it somehow doesn't mean that they share the same values as Western feminism. These Muslim feminists then complain that those criticizing feminism shouldn't generalize feminism. #not all feminists. Muslim feminists claim that despite the Western origins of feminism, its original Western meaning, the current-day accepted and mainstream understanding of it in the West and globally, the large preponderance of Western scholars, activists, and philosophers that regularly publish books about it, somehow Muslim feminism, as their small coterie of followers have chosen to define it, doesn't contradict Islam and therefore shouldn't be resisted by Muslims. Muslims hearing this then wonder what's the point of taking a Western term, with a mainstream global following, intellectuals and activists, and pre-existing understanding, and then superimposing it on Islam, when Islam is accepted by all Muslims to be self-sufficient. Indeed, wouldn't it act only to provide confusion? Unfortunately, when Muslims point out all these issues, Muslim feminists react angrily and use defensive tactics like responding, "Why are you against rights for Muslim women?" This argument, which can be heard quite commonly as an almost defensive mechanism to avert reasoned criticism, is actually as fallacious an accusation as being told, "Why are you against the rights of poor people and the working class?" just because you criticize communism. The simple truth of the matter is that using ideologically loaded labels originating in un-Islamic ideologies could possibly provide an entry for un-Islamic ideas, as Muslims calling themselves feminists then bump into the mainstream, Western, understanding, and vast literature of works which also labels themselves as feminism and feminist literature. On the other side of the coin, another problem so-called Muslim feminists encounter is that in the West, Westerners don't call feminism as Western feminism, they simply call it feminism. And why not? They invented it. They defined it. And all schools of thought within feminism agree with the minimal definition of the secular liberal, and also communist, formula that feminism means equal rights for women, by which they mean gender identicality under law. However, while Islam believes that the souls of men and women have equal value in the eyes of God, Islamic law doesn't posit identical gender roles or obligations. The difference between Islam and mainstream feminism become highlighted when these so-called Muslim feminists appear on TV or hold talks and conferences where mainstream Western feminists turn up and challenge them on Islam's contradictions with mainstream, original, feminism. Points raised by feminists include the idea of head of the family, inheritance, lack of identical rights, and the gender roles of women and men in families, as well as gender differences in political/military responsibilities, leading to Muslim feminists being put on the spot and desperately obfuscating at best, or obsequiously placating Western feminists with reinterpretations of Islam at worst. In order to avoid scrutiny from Western mainstream society into the details of Muslim feminism, some Muslim feminists use diversion tactics, like complaining that they're having their definition of feminism being imposed upon by Western feminism advocated by white people and colonialists. Sadly, the irony is that it is actually the Muslim feminists who have been already colonized in thought, as evidenced by the fact they desperately sought to borrow Western terms and ideological labels like feminism to make themselves look respectable and gain currency for themselves in the first place. These Muslims cling with all their might to the term feminism because they wish to use Western language in their causes in order to gain currency for them, regardless of whether or not these terms carry pre-existing and well-known un-Islamic connotations and ideological baggage. But as everybody knows, if you use the currency of a country, you surrender to them the right to determine its value, and eventually, you end up paying for it. As famously, allegedly, narrated of Jesus in the New Testament, when in the Holy Temple, he was, allegedly, asked by his opponents about whether devout Jews should pay taxes to the pagan emperor in Rome, whose empire was occupying the lands of the Jews. Should we pay or shouldn't we? But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Why are you trying to trap me? He asked. Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. They brought the coin, and he asked them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then Jesus said to them, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. And they were amazed at him. Mark 12:15-17. An amazing response indeed, because the people had gladly accepted the coin and currency of their dominator, even in their holy temple, but hypocritically quibbled on paying taxes to him to make themselves look good. Falsehood belongs to humans, and anything taken from them should be returned, but to God belongs everything in the heavens and the earth, including human affairs, law, rights, and duties. Therefore, in response, we must hold up the proverbial Roman denarius and ask Muslim feminists. Ask them, who coined the term feminism, stamped their image upon it, and originated it, which you use for currency? They'll sheepishly admit, the West. Say, give back to the West what belongs to the West, and give unto God what belongs to God. So there is no point using this term feminism to Islam, unless you have other agenda, to change and deform Islam. And if you question Muslim feminist, if you really are satisfied with Islam, then what's the point labeling yourself with feminism? Muslim feminist will say, but Muslim men aren't giving us our due right, really, so you using feminism helps you gaining those rights. If Muslim men don't give you under Islam, then why will they give you under other foreign man-made ideology? Truth be told, these feminists wants more. They want to change Islam. If you read their scholars' book, you will find this, saying stuff like, oh, we just want rights, what Islam give us, is just tactic to fool Muslim, so that Muslim lower their guard down and these feminists can infiltrate into Muslim community. And many feminists did actually successfully infiltrated Muslim community. If you observe these self-identified Muslim feminist or sympathizer of this ideology, you will see almost all of them either internalized Western norm, morality, liberalism, or they don't like some aspect of Islam, for example gender role. They don't like the concept of qawwam, man being the leader, or the concept of hijab, or about Muslim man can marry Jews and Christians who are chaste, but Muslim women can't, or about polygyny, the idea that Muslim man can marry more than one wife, or the concept of hur al-ain. You will see many of these people also reject authentic hadith. So as you can see, many of them are uncomfortable of certain teaching of Islam. Rather than submitting their will to God, these people choose to submit to their desire, so they look for the validation of their desire. And they find it on Islamic feminism, where you can ditch out any Islamic teaching you don't like under the name of patriarchal misogynistic interpretation. All you didn't like are just wrong interpretation made by Muslim male. This is how they comfort themselves. In short, they are trying to change Islam, deform it as their desire, and you will see this in the writing of Muslim feminist scholars. One of the prominent Islamic feminist scholars, Amina Wadud, said, for explicit verses of the Quran for which feminists cannot find alternative explanations, the possibility of rejecting these verses should be considered. She states, personally, I have come to places where how the text says what it says is just plain inadequate or unacceptable, however much interpretation is enacted upon it. And she says further, that where particular articulations in the Quran as a text are problematic, there is the possibility of refuting the text, to talk back, to even say no. Wadud talked about the frustrations that feminists feel when, as Wadud suggests, they have to pretend to advocate feminism from an Islamic perspective, and not a secular liberal one. She writes, the executive director of Sisters in Islam, Zaina Anwar, once asked, why can't we say we are working for gender justice from a human rights perspective instead of our earlier claim of working from a gender-inclusive Islamic perspective? Quite honestly, I understand the frustrations. In other words, these feminists are not acting as interpreters, or even reinterpreters, but as secular liberal interpolators. Wadud and Asma Lamrabet argue that the Islamic injunction for a wife to obey her husband, in what is permitted under the Sharia, or halal, contradicts the oneness of God, as they claim that obedience is for God alone. If obedience to the husband constitutes idolatry, then, according to such feminists, a boy obeying his mother would also be idolatry, being a law-abiding citizen would be idolatry, and a Muslim obeying the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which the Quran explicitly commands, would also be idolatry. Another Muslim feminist scholar, Ziba Mir Hosseini, describes the male reformists, Tahir al-Haddad, Fazlur Rahman, and Nasser Abu Zaid as the backbone of feminist scholarship in Islam. So backbone of feminist scholarship are those who want to change Islam to adopt with Western ideology. Mir Hosseini states that Muslim reformist thinkers have tried to reconcile what they understood to be fundamental principles in Muslim law and ethics with modernist conceptions of justice and gender relations. Others use Western conceptions of human rights as their framework, and others invoke vague references to contemporary ethics. Allah says in the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:49-50, do they then seek the judgment of those in ignorance? And who is better in judgment than Allah for a people who have firm faith?